Hello everyone, welcome back to week 4, intercultural competence and communication. A bit colder today. I've been enjoying sitting out in the backyard and doing these, but it's very frosty today, so we're parked in the study. Hope you're enjoying the course so far. Hope you had fun with the first assessment task. It's been interesting to read. Got some great responses. I'll send you some feedback as soon as I can. So we're into week 4 this week. Looking at the second part of Introduction to Intercultural Competency, a view of intercultural competency. So recapping from last week, we looked at culture. We found that culture is learned. Culture is a set of shared interpretations. Culture involves beliefs, values, and norms. Culture affects behaviour. I think these are great things to keep in mind when studying one of the focal points for the semester, Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. Good to think about, these sort of various facets of culture as they apply to each stage of the DMIS: denial, defense, minimization, acceptance, adaptation, and integration. And you'll recall the key concepts from weeks 1 and 2, which I asked you to include in assessment task 4 responses. Please continue to do so in parts 2 through 6. Colonialism, Orientalism, ethnocentrism, othering, cultural hegemony, whiteness, stereotyping, deviance production, and moral disengagement. I hammered those a fair bit, so I won't go over them again. But just to recap, remember the concept. Key concepts for this week. We'll look at continue looking at the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity in a bit more detail. Going to look at a few aspects of metacognition. This is a favourite buzzword of education. People who study education, educationalists, thinking about the ways that we form ideas, thinking about the ways that we learn, thinking about the ways that we think. So we'll look at a couple of aspects of this. We'll look at the learning style inventory. We looked at that in the readings a little bit last week. We'll go into it in a bit more detail. And another aspect of metacognition, the intercultural development inventory. I'll look at that in the readings a little bit this week. These are both introductions to, sort of lead-ins to what we'll be looking at when we begin looking at intercultural communication in earnest next week. With experiential learning, we're looking at that a little bit already this week. This is a lead-in to looking at that in more detail. And we'll finish off with looking at a couple of other approaches to study of intercultural competence. Hofstede and Trompenaars and the limits of functionalism. We're taking one particular approach, but I want you to find out a bit more about the other approaches. It's good to know what else is out there to sort of know, to sort of put things in perspective a bit, I think. So we'll look at those just to round off the session. So if we start off, let's start off by going into a bit more detail with the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. I want to spend a little more time looking at it today, because I want you to be able to distinguish when you go to do the next stages of your assessment task 4, how to differentiate the stages from one another. So the point of this is to get a bit more of an insight into, what makes the stages unique and how you're going to find examples of the DMIS, which sort of can be clearly differentiated for each stage. So you recall from last week, we looked at denial. In this first stage, individuals refuse all interaction with other cultures and show no interest in discovering cultural differences. They may also act aggressively during cross-cultural situations. So in this, going into a bit more detail, we're looking at the undifferentiated other. You'll recall from the key concepts in the first week that othering was a very clear example of the processes associated with colonialism, with ethnocentrism, with all the dynamics associated with Orientalism. So there's a very clear cultural and historical basis for that. I think that's sort of, the colonial context puts puts stage 1 denial into context, I think. In terms of, specifically in purpose of the purposes it serves. So we find out also that it's polarized into, us and them thinking, talking about you people, as a one person sort of has to, uh, answer for, an entire group. Find that there with Muslims especially. Anytime any Muslim does anything wrong, um, every one of them has to account for it somehow. But not the same when you have an Australian sort of committing a gun outrage in New Zealand. There's quite a conspicuous contrast there. Social Darwinism. We looked at that. We talked about that in the on-campus lectures a little bit. Darwin's idea was natural selection, which was sort of based on this idea of sort of survival of the fittest. But that was sort of twisted. If you read something like Kropotkin's Mutual Aid, there are different ways that the fittest can be defined. Fittest can be defined in terms of the capacity for mutual support and solidarity and cooperation. But it was in terms of affecting a fit for justifications of stage one denial. Survival of the fittest turned into a concept geared around competition and the capacity to dominate, and the might makes right mentality. So I think that's arguably sort of far removed from what Darwin originally meant, but it was, as in many cases, ideas can be twisted around to suit whatever purposes you like. We justify all sorts of heinous things these days in the name of democracy. We need to make the world safe for democracy by committing war crimes and acts of international aggression. That's the kind of logic that's prevailed over the last 20 years, by twisting ideas to serve your purposes. And social Darwinism is no different. That's in terms of stage one denial, it's this idea of natural selection had to be twisted pretty much beyond recognition in order to be turned into a justification for sort of brutal exercise of power, sort of in the purposes of colonialism and extractivism and and Orientalism and all related concepts. So another again sort of bringing a stage one denial into a bit more focus. Benign neglect is an interesting one as well. It can't be helped. I think we see that with the indigenous population a lot. Well, there was the classic example of I forget her name, but the sort of white paternalist who said that the indigenous population was dying out and we had to help smooth their pillow to ease their passing, because it can't be helped. Meanwhile, people like Fraser Anning's forefathers are running around shooting them en masse. This benign neglect. Well, they're just it's just a superior race overcoming an inferior race. The social Darwinist idea, the might makes right. So another facet of benign neglect is sort of part of this paternalistic mentality associated with sort of us and them, and cultural supremacism as well. And we find that in the this idea that they don't value life the way we do as a rationale for the exercise of power, because they're the savages, the terrorists. They're the other. They're they just don't share our cultural sensitivities. They don't have any. They're brutes who need to be taken care of, I guess. So that's stage one denial in a bit more detail. These comes from the readings last week, so have a read through those again. Stage two defense. These are all we notice these are both ethnocentric concepts as well. Stage two defense. In this stage, you'll recall individuals consider all other cultures to be inferior to their own culture and will constantly criticize behavioral thoughts by someone from another culture. So in this stage, we find that this sort of manifests itself as, other cultures seen in more complex ways, but still considered inferior. I think the difference is now that they're actually, they are actually recognised. So actually recognised now, but not still sort of seen from the viewpoint of cultural supremacy. We're still polarized into us and them. So you'll recall that we've got this is the sort of characterizing feature of stage one denial. So we've still got the us and them binary thinking. But because cultures are recognized, we find more of a siege mentality. There's that great clip from South Park. They took our jobs. I'll have to dig that one up and post it on Moodle. The line. They're coming to the country, taking our jobs and our women. In Australia, it was the Italians and Greeks in the 50s. In the 60s, it was in the 70s, it was Vietnamese with the Vietnam War. The 80s, it was the Lebanese. 90s, it was the Asians. I think in the 2000s, probably people of Arabic background because of the whole, war of terror thing. The terror scare, the moral panic over terrorism. And these days, it's new immigrants from South Sudan. It's every decade there's another sort of bugbear kind of alleged existential threat to Australian culture and mores. Defined specifically in terms of the prevailing culturally hegemonic North European Anglo-white population. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So this is stage two defense. Still very much in ethnocentric mode, us and them. Institutional separation is another feature, e.g., racial segregation in the US after the Civil War up to 1967, I think it was. Had or mid 60s at least, racial segregation. The infamous Jim Crow laws. I forget what they called it that exactly, but they were racially segregated, and they always had similar things here. I have a mate who wrote a travel diary, and he's talking about going up to the Northern Territory and going to a pub where the white fellas and black fellas were segregated. He was surprised. We have segregation in Australia. Why isn't this against the law? Because no one knows about it. It's sort of back in the kind of back bars where they can get away with it, and obviously the white power is also the law. So separation. They don't deny that other cultures exist. They acknowledge that they exist, but they believe that they're inferior. So I think that's sort of one of the main, probably one of the major differences between stage one denial and stage two defense. I have an interesting phenomenon at this stage called reversal, where instead of the siege mentality, the us and them. There's a bit of the us and them idea in that, but rather than cultural supremacy, there's the sort of complete opposite thing of going native. I think the example I brought up from last week of William Buckley probably fits more into this stage. Rejecting the dominant culture completely, and sort of going off into complete sort of polar opposite. Is this a healthy way to deal with intercultural communication? Well, it's debatable. The sort of maybe it can be construed as a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. Instead of learning how to cooperate, you just sort of go to the other extreme. I'll be interested to see what you have to say in the tutorial, but it's sort of worth in the cheats and online. I'll definitely be interested to hear what everyone has to say. Stage 3, minimization. This is the last stage of the ethnocentric part of the DMIS. As we saw, when the stage is reached, individuals start believing that cultures share common values. Also, minimize any cultural differences by correcting people to match their expectations. So I think they're like the characteristic. Difference of this stage here we've got defense, where all cultures are considered cultures other than the dominant culture are considered inferior. This one, the differences are just sort of papered over altogether. So they don't. It's not denial so much as almost whitewashing, I think. But always, everyone's always equal, in terms of the dominant culture. So we're all. It's more like it's more like a sort of an internal colonialism, as to match the external one. It's kind of you're allowed to be one of us, not not we're all we're all sort of diverse and equally valuable. Bennett describes this as the most complex strategy of avoiding cultural difference. Perhaps because there's still this sort of ethnocentric idea, but with this pretense of being something else. So, as I mentioned, cultural differences are suppressed rather than avoided. Deep down, we're all the same. Well, in one sense we are, but culturally we're diverse. It's not the same. Others are also the archetypal others are also recognised to be culturally complex, but this is assumed to be in the same way. We're all God's children. I mean, we're not all Allah's children or all Buddha's children. We're all God's children. So that's the cultural supremacy sort of. That's kind of like bizarrely like a democratic supremacy. Like we're all allowed to be part of the dominant culture. So it's a funny nuance, but I think it's sort of one that we can sort of quite, it's easy enough to conceive of. So we find that cultures rather than individuals are abstracted and submerged into the dominant worldview. So it's not sort of an attack on individuals, but it's deeper. People will you can talk to someone from a different background, but you're still kind of patronizing rather than overtly hateful. Patronizing is, of course, a sort of hateful attitude in its own way, and so we find the in inverted commas color blindness, which also means because diversity is suppressed rather than embraced. We find it also includes blindness towards continuing forms of oppression. I mean, it's not just color blindness. It's sort of like we're all blokes here. Can be gender based. Where it's sort of you're allowed to exist as long as you sort of submit to the dominant paradigm, the dominant culture. So, and because cultural differences are suppressed, continuing issues are suppressed. I mean, you find that when we're sort of insisting, well, I'm colorblind, I don't see race, but at the same time, we won't acknowledge because you don't see race, you can't see continuing racial oppression either, and that's sort of arguably part of the purpose of that of this minimization stage. The mentality associated with it. So once we swap over from move past the minimization stage, we get to the first stage of DMIS ethno-relativism, which is stage 4 acceptance. As we saw last week, at this stage, individuals may still judge other cultures negatively, but they'll tend to recognize that cultures are different and they may become curious about cultural differences. So because we are into an ethno-relative stage now, it becomes possible to differentiate cultures, and not just Australian inverted commas with meaning white Anglo with a subtext. Australian can be understood to mean Asian Australian, Lebanese Australian, Arab Australian, you name it, Greek Australian, Italian Australian. Cultural relativity emerges from ethnocentric us and them dualism. So we move beyond the dualistic framework, like this binary framework. Dualism is sort of, I mean, what's the classic dualism? The classic dualism is good versus evil. Black and white. It's either one or the other. So I think part of developing a broader, not just a broader understanding of culture, but a broader understanding of existence in general is learning to see the grey area beyond the black and whites. Is that there's the classic idea of the duality of man. If you've ever seen Full Metal Jacket, the one of the main protagonists is walking around with a peace symbol on his helmet, and comes into conflict with a major at one stage, and wants to know, why are you wearing a peace symbol on your helmet? And then, like, the classical response is because of the duality of man. And the major says, the what? And the guy the protagonist has to explain what it's all about. The Jungian thing. We a propensity to embody seemingly sort of opposing forces. We're all kind of walking contradictions to one extent or another. Things sort of often depend on subjective point of view. I mean, one person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. All these kinds of ideas. This is a bit extraneous to the topic, but it's just sort of, these are issues that come up in terms of black and white, us and then dualism versus relativistic perspectives, which can incorporate multiple points of view at once. So we might not understand the culture, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It's the black and white point of view that tends to give rise to that the mentality that you're either with us or against us. What's that? It's just completely escapes me. It's the fallacy that sort of refuses to acknowledge any distinction between being criticized and being attacked. I mean, you can't be criticized because someone sort of has your best interests in mind and wants to help you. You can only be criticized because someone's acting out of hate. I mean, that's a very kind of black and white dualistic mentality. But if you kind of if you can entertain more than one perspective at once, it becomes possible to rise above that. So we're rising above the dualistic black and white mentality to a mentality that can sort of entertain a bit of grey area. That things that might be strange are not necessarily bad. One's own, and this is sort of encapsulated in the idea that one's own position is only one of several. And once we sort of begin to kind of, appreciate difference, we can understand that, we're different. There are different perspectives, and other perspectives can be just as valid as our own. So at this stage, all cultures are accepted as equal but different. Moving to the acceptance stage does not necessarily mean other cultures are accepted or liked, but they are accepted as existing and having a right to exist. At this stage, we also find contextual relativism, making ethical choices on the basis of contextual criteria rather than in observance of absolute categories. I mean, this is part of overcoming this kind of very kind of binary black and white a priori thinking. The very stuck in stone. This is how it is, and anything that doesn't fit into this framework is wrong. So we're not only we're not sort of making token efforts to at cultural diversity. We're undergoing a bit of personal growth and appreciating the value of other perspectives and other points of view, and sort of appreciating that there's more to life than what exists outside of our own direct experience. So moving on to the latter stages, we find stage 5, ethno-relativism and adaptation. During this stage, individuals gain the ability to adapt their behaviour more easily and effectively by intentionally changing their own behaviour or communication style. So we find that in this stage, distinguishing from the acceptance stage, that we begin to be a bit more proactive in terms of cognitive frame shifting. So we're considering perspectives of other cultures. We're not just sort of acknowledging that they exist and acknowledging their right to exist. We're acknowledging their value. So in this, we also find cultural empathy, organizing experience through constructs of another culture. It's not just the sort of considering perspectives, but taking on the ideas. So, in this, we expand our concept of selfhood to include cultural experience outside of our own conditioning and upbringing. I mean, because there are so many different perspectives. It's almost like a subjective ecology. I mean, there's so much to know from other points of view. I mean, why would you want to stop at one? So I mean, it's there are sort of in these latter stages of ethno-relativism where there's a great deal of kind of personal growth going on, broadening of horizons. Often this is Bennett says this is unintentional adaptation, which can be culture specific. Does not necessarily indicate a general capacity for ethno-relativism. I mean, you go traveling, so you get gain a greater appreciation of one particular culture in particular, or you're working in a particular country. So, I'm working in wherever, Iran, Afghanistan, Africa. You get one part of Africa, Ivory Coast, Tanzania. You work in one particular country. So you get I got a particular appreciation for Tanzanian culture. But that doesn't kind of mean that that's sort of unintentional insofar as, you're doing it as part of, as extraneous to something else that you're doing. You're not sort of becoming, generally adaptable. So that's probably a difference between stage 5 and stage 6. We'll look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. This is what we call a bicultural condition. So, I don't know. Maybe you spend a lot of time in Richmond around the Vietnamese shops, and you get to know the Vietnamese people and get a bit more of a feel for Vietnamese culture. Or you go to Bali a lot, so you get a bit more of a feeling for Balinese culture. I mean, this is bicultural. It doesn't mean you're sort of moving around from group to group, and you'd still go to Bali and then hate on Sudanese people. So I mean, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily you have a general capacity for ethno-relativism. It means you're you're beginning to sort of develop that capacity in one particular context. When it becomes more generalized, is in stage 6 of the DMIS. This is the integration stage. As we saw, tends only to be achieved by long-term expatriates living and working abroad or global nomads. In this stage, individuals instinctively change their behaviour and communication style when interacting with other cultures. Well, again, why do we have to think about cultures in terms of nationalities? I think that's quite limited. Where there's so many cultures, if nothing else, because of the amount of moving around that people are doing globally these days. We have huge immigrant communities in Australia. And there are so many different cultures in society as well. Like the major social categories, so gender, class, ethnicity, including the dominant white Anglo ethnicity, sexuality, ability, subcultures, sports, community groups. Cultures galore. Unions. The cultures everywhere. There's no reason why cultural adaptability and competency has to be sort of defined in national terms. Especially considering the arbitrariness of borders. You're going to Iraq or the Middle East and talking about national culture. It's there's a reason why the Middle East is so unstable. It's because the national borders drawn up by the the British and the French were designed specifically to divide national cultures and to create, ethnic minorities and majorities that they could play off against one another, the same way they did in India. It's a classic divide and conquer strategy. So these are very serious limitations to thinking about the culture in national terms, and we can come back to this later. In fact, in talking about looking at functionalism. But this is, ethno-relativism, stage 6 integration. We've got the personal growth into identity that incorporates multiple cultures. So it's not just sort of like I have to be, there's newfangled, PC Nazi stuff that says we have to be diverse now. This sort of hip, trendy multiculturalism thing. It's more than that. It's about the, broadening of perspectives and, realigning values with understanding that we exist in the world, and that there's far more to be understood beyond their own kind of narrow conditioning and upbringing. So personal growth into identity that incorporates multiple cultures, identity marginal to any one culture. So there's no dominant culture that needs to be protected. We can take ideas and perspectives from all sorts of different places. Got a constructive versus encapsulated marginality in terms of this, identity being marginal to any one culture. Our identity is flexible and moving between cultures rather than being unable to recognize and act on nuances in cultural variance. So, we're proactive and adaptive and sort of being aware that, people are different and we do things differently, and being able to, appreciate and sort of be flexible in terms of, dealing with different cultures and perspectives. I think this Bennett talks about this in terms of multicultural condition. It's not just, being, we're all multicultural now because, that's what they say in the diversity training. It's, understanding that, building on a broader understanding of global awareness and awareness of diversity and the breadth and depth of difference and its value in the world in general. So that's a bit more of an in-depth look at the DMIS. Keep this in mind for your assessment task 4. This is the sort of the main value of doing this thing at this point, I think. And all of which ultimately begs the $1 million question: how do we move from lower to higher stages of intercultural competence? I mean, this is after all, arguably what we're looking at the DMIS for. We need to be able to sort of identify different stages of intercultural competence and move from one to the other. I mean, move from one to the other ourselves and encourage and help others to do the same. I mean, this is what we're going to be looking at in detail in weeks 5 to 8. This is the whole point of studying intercultural competence. But this is the purpose of the last week's and this week's lectures, to sort of introduce the framework for doing this program, this process. At the outset, in beginning to deal with moving from lower to higher stages of intercultural competence, we have some procedural questions in terms of assessment and learning styles. Specifically, this means, how do we know what stage of intercultural competence we and any others we might seek to communicate with are at? You need to know your audience. You need to know who you're talking to. You can't assume that you're going to be talking to stage 6, integrated personality every time you talk to someone. We can't assume that we're all stage 6 integrated levels of competency ourselves. So we have to start by understanding figuring out where we're at. We also need to figure out how we can learn to be more interculturally competent and what are the styles that learning can take place. And finally, we need to learn how to relate to others in more culturally competent ways. How we do this, taking into account and anticipating cultural differences. And, thinking about it at the same time, what are the styles in which this can be accomplished? So as noted at the start, these are issues of metacognition. This is, thinking about how we think, how we learn, how we develop ideas, how we can consciously sort of, develop ideas and, broaden perspectives, because that's what we're all about. There's a link down the bottom with some more reading you can check out on this sort of concept in general. So, think about this in more detail. This metacognition issue. We're looking at this week a little bit on the learning styles inventory. This is just an overview. I mean, you can go and there's a link down the bottom to the questionnaire that you should go and do. We'll be handing out copies of the questionnaire in class for the on-campus students. You should download it, check it out. Find out where your own learning style's at. Great sort of example of this assessment part of the process of moving through stages of intercultural competency. Kolb's learning style inventory is designed to determine an individual's learning preferences. It describes learning preferences using two continuums: active experimentation and reflective observation, and abstract conceptualization and concrete experience. I mean, these are sort of poles of learning preferences. So active experimentation is, practical, hands-on, versus the reflective observation, which is, sitting around kind of thinking about stuff. Abstract conceptualization is sort of same kind of, is different from reflective observation in being, sort of a bit more proactive, sort of reflecting on, rather than reflecting on what you've done, sort of conceiving of what you can do in the future. And active experimentation is sort of, is sort of different from concrete experience. So, I mean, in terms of sort of trying stuff and finding out what happened versus, looking at what did happen. So, very different approaches. These continuums are the result of four types of learners. We've got the converger, the active experimentation and abstract conceptualization, so involving those two continuums. The accommodator, active experimentation combined with concrete experience. The assimilator, reflective observation combined with abstract conceptualization. And diverger, the reflective observation combined with concrete experience. Converger, active experimentation, abstract conceptualization. So you're starting off by experimenting and then sort of combining this with, theorizing, I guess, in order to sort of come up with new ideas. The accommodator, you're experimenting with what you've already discovered in concrete experience. The assimilator, you're combining reflective observation with abstract conceptualization. So you're looking at what's going on, and then trying to combine that with theorizing about what could work. And the diverger, reflective observation and concrete experience. That's an interesting one. You're looking at what's going on and combining it with your own experiences. We'll think about those more in the weeks to come, I think. But there's just sort of a general overview. The learning style inventory sort of brings us into what will be I think sort of the main theme for the next 4 lectures: the experiential learning model. The learning style inventory is based on experiential learning model, which David Kolb and Ron Fry developed in the early 1970s. ELM is composed of 4 elements: concrete experience, observation of and reflection of that experience, formation of abstract concepts based upon the reflection, testing the new concepts, and repeat ad infinitum. It's 4 elements to the basis of a spiral learning that can begin with any one of the 4 elements, but typically begins with a concrete experience. We'll look at the ELM and its relation to moving through the stages of intercultural sensitivity in more detail in next week, in week 5. But again, I mean, these are sort of some of the practical ways that we can sort of start to sort of think about, once we've, assessing how we're, our learning style for moving through stages of intercultural sensitivity, and then some of the ways of starting to do that through, I think that, probably the main value of the experiential learning model is, using sort of theorizing and experience, practical experience, and, building on that. And there's the questionnaire down the bottom again if you want to check that out. We looked at this a little bit last week. This is the learning style inventory. Again, at the top, I've got the concrete experience, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation, sort of incorporating, accommodating, diverging, assimilating, and converging forms of processing, accommodating feel and do, diverging feel and watch, assimilating think and watch, converging think and do. So there you go. That sort of helps to clarify it even more. Just keep that in mind. We'll come back to it again in coming weeks. Second part of metacognition we're going to look at this week is the intercultural development inventory. One of your readings for this week is based on this. Intercultural development inventory is a proprietary tool that assesses intercultural competence, the capability to shift cultural perspective and appropriately adapt behaviour to cultural differences and commonalities. Since this is a proprietary tool, I mean, we can't really look at it, which is a bit of a pain and possibly a potential drawback of the tool itself. I mean, would be very helpful if we could just get it and do it in class. I did spend it, or at home online. I did actually spend a bit of time trying to find even a practice exam. But it looks like you have to pay $11 US to do it as an individual. I mean, if you're thinking about taking this, what we're studying in this unit and using it to help, encourage, do sort of diversity training or anything like that. The intercultural development inventory will be very useful as a thing to sort of use in a formal context. I don't know that it's so useful in a more informal and general environment, but it's also good to know that it's there. One question I sort of thought was interesting is what value is this kind of testing the process of moving from lower to higher stages of intercultural competence, and maybe more specifically, can we do anything similar but more informally, relying on a knowledge of the key concepts we examined in weeks 1 and 2? I mean, I think without the formal proprietary tool at our disposal, we might have to try to rely on sort of broader historical knowledge and key concepts, because I mean it's another way of sort of providing context and a more history-based way of contextualizing the issue and performing this assessment tasks that is sort of necessary to begin moving between between the stages. So we can see here we've got a few sample questions. I did find a few questions in a Google image search. So you can see here we've got questions along the lines of: I'm conscious of the cultural knowledge I use when interacting with people from different cultural backgrounds. I adjust my cultural knowledge as I interact with people from a culture that is unfamiliar to me. Conscious of the cultural knowledge that apply to cross-cultural interactions. I check the accuracy of my cultural knowledge as I interact with people from different cultures. So in answering these questions, we can obviously sort of begin to think about, reflect on our own attitudes, and in a more formal environment, if you're working with, because I mean, they do a lot of, as we'll see in a moment, they do a lot of diversity training with people who work with large sectors of the public, the healthcare system, in social work. This is when things like these formal proprietary tools like the intercultural development inventory seem to become of more use, and apparently the use is quite widespread as well. I mean, this is a bit of their own sales pitch. Cross-culturally validated assessment of intercultural competence, 50-item questionnaire, back-translated in 14 languages, available online and in paper versions. Included open-ended questions and ability to add 6 unique questions. Customized to educational or organisational applications. Able to produce customised individual group, subgroup and organisation-wide IDI profile reports. All individual IDI profile reports accompanied by customized and cultural development plans. So actually do a bit more kind of help in terms of helping suggesting ways that people can kind of develop their intercultural sensitivity and competence. IDI is cross-culturally validated with over 10,000 individuals across a wide range of cultures, both domestic and international diversity. No cultural bias, not transparent. It's no social desirability. So you're not. This aspect means that you're not answering because you they try to compensate for people trying to answer because they think it's what people want to hear. This is this is sort of important in terms of moving beyond the tokenistic. We're doing this diversity training because it's the the hip PC thing, which we have to do it. Doing it because it's really important, and it's sort of important to our sort of growth as people, as individuals. Demonstrated content, constructing predictive validity in organizations and educational institutions, over 60 published articles and book chapters, and 66 PhD dissertations used by 1,800 qualified IDI administrators in 30 countries. So it's obviously fairly well established. Here's a great example of application of the IDI to community health nursing, the baccalaureate program in the US. I won't read through all this now. It's just there's a link to the slide if you want to look at this in more detail. I just thought this was interesting in terms of the application of the IDI to practical context to in aid of this this assessment phase of beginning this process of developing greater intercultural competency. So take a look at it if you like. I think it's worth reading through. And finally, there's this thing which is similar to the DMIS. It actually says down the bottom, it's modified from the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. The intercultural development continuum. So I mean, it's similar. It's the stages of development of intercultural competency: denial, polarization, minimization, acceptance, adaptation. They're moving from monocultural to intercultural mindset. It might be sort of easier for I think they probably did this for the purposes of more easily kind of in training sessions, more easily representing the the DMIS. I mean, we've sort of gone through it in 2 full-length tutorials. There's just a simplified version for probably for largest consumption. Denial misses difference, polarization judges difference, minimization de-emphasizes difference, acceptance deeply comprehends difference, and then adaptation bridges across difference. So there's only 2 stages of ethno-relativism there, but I think the similarities to the DMIS are quite similar. Let's leave the DMIS and the sort of this introduction to intercultural this aspect of intercultural competence for the moment. Just before we as a final thing for today, I just want to look at other perspectives on intercultural competence, because we've focused in the main so far on the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity and Bennett. So I mean, let's just sort of I mean, there are multiple approaches to intercultural sensitivity. I mean, do we we want to be sure that the one that we're looking at is the best or the most useful? I mean, in developing this unit, I looked at a couple of different approaches. The approach that this unit used to take was actually based on one of the approaches that we're going to look at. The works of Trompenas, which is what we call a functionalist approach, which is, while intercultural competency is most often it's a broad field. It's based on anthropology, linguistics, cultural studies, sociology, history. This is from the humanities approach. From a business management perspective, it applies what we call a functionalist approach. I think it's the point of intercultural competency is it's a means to an end. It's a means to enabling greater business management. It's not a sort of it's not a question of the greater social good, social harmony, communication, like personal growth, like intercultural competence, strengthening of society, anything like that. There's sort of more to, purposes of making money, basically. So we'll look at this for a minute. I just found this image of a bird. You might see a bird flying, but I prefer to imagine it's a rabbit doing an impressive long jump on skis. Okay, I can see the rabbit doing a long jump. The point of this photo is just to point out that there's always more than one way to look at something, and we should always consider all sides of an idea, even if they're not very good ones. So with that in mind, let's go to functionalism. First example of functionalism I'm going to look at is Gert Hofstadter. Hofstadter's cultural dimensions theory is a framework for cross-cultural communication. It describes the effects of a society's culture on the values of its members and how these values relate to behaviour using a structure derived from factor analysis. Hofstadter developed his original model as a result of using factor analysis to examine the results of a survey of employee values by IBM between 1967 and 1973 in the US, China, Germany, and Brazil. Okay, so he basically, what this means is Hofstadter basically sampled a bunch of engineers, and on the basis of, various nominated values, and came up with a concept of, cultural dimensions theory. There's a link to an article where you can read a bit more about this down the bottom. The main elements of cultural dimensions theory Hofstadter proposed was individualism versus collectivism, uncertainty avoidance, power distance, the strength of the social hierarchy, masculinity, femininity, task orientation versus person orientation, and indulgence versus self-restraint. So what were some of the, criticisms of this? Some said that aside from these dimensions, there are innumerable other factors through which culture can be analysed. By what standards were these six selected in particular? Individualism, collectivism, uncertainty avoidance, power distance, and so forth. How can we know that they were chosen for any reason other than subjective utility, functionality, or instrumentality? I mean, instrumentality means using things or people for your own purposes, not for the purposes of... one of the things we've been looking at in this unit is the idea of intercultural competence as a relational thing. Based, on relationship of equality and reciprocity and mutual respect. I mean, there's very little in this concept of that in this, functionalist or instrumentalist approach. It's about using cultural competence as better ways to get people to do stuff for you. There's very little scientific basis to sort of figuring out why, these kind of dimensions be chosen on what basis. And again, I mean, they're sort of using this, national culture sort of paradigm. There are so many other ways of assessing culture besides the nation state as we've looked at. It's also a sampling discrepancy that disqualifies the survey from being authoritative on organisations or societies or nations. People pointed out that Hofstadter's interviews involve sales and engineering personnel with fewer, if any, women or social minorities participating. I mean, when you're doing a sample, you need to make sure your distribution is equal. I mean, there were no kind of safeguards in that respect at all. Even if country indices were used to control for wealth, latitude, population size, density, and growth, privileged males working as engineers or sales personnel in one of the most elite organisations in the world, i.e. IBM, pioneering one of the first multinational projects in history, cannot be claimed to represent their nations. So, very kind of some quite skewed, data there. There's a link to McSweeney. This is, from what I can tell, this is the sort of classic critique of Hofstadter. Hofstadter's model of national cultural differences and their consequences, the triumph of faith, the failure of analysis. The other main proponent of functionalism, arguably, is Fons Trompenaars. Trompenaars, this is what this unit used to be based on. Trompenaars' model of national cultural differences is a framework for cross-cultural communication applied to general business and management. Trompenaars' model of national cultural differences is 7 dimensions, as opposed to Hofstede's 6. Universalism versus particularism. What is more important, rules or relationships? Individualism versus collectivism. Do we function as a group or individuals? Neutral versus emotional. Do we display our emotions? Specific versus diffuse. How separate do we keep our private and working lives? Achievement versus ascription. Do we have to prove ourselves or receive status, or is it given to us? Sequential versus synchronic. Do we do things one at a time or several things at once? Internal versus external control. Do we control the environment or are we controlled by it? These are obviously very work, economistic based questions. I personally think the functionalism here is quite overt. It's all based on work. But if you're very keen to read Trompenaars, you can check out his book through the link down the bottom, Riding the Waves of Culture. That's understanding diversity in global business. I think riding the waves of culture says something in itself, not sort of being in the waves of culture. It's, making use of them for your own purposes. So according to Trompenaars' national cultural differences model, some of the criticisms from the perspective of functionalism or instrumentalism, all the same criticisms that apply to Hofstede. Hofstede claimed that only 2 dimensions of Trompenaars' model could be identified, and both of them were correlated with his own individualism dimension. Trompenaars does not recognise the impact of personal characteristics on behaviour, factors such as education, upbringing, all culture that exists beyond the framework and political borders, which is probably most of it. I think this was pretty much, also a major criticism of Hofstede. Trompenaars differentiates various cultures, but does not elaborate recommendations on how to act within specific cultures. It's purely theoretical. There's nothing of the DMIS, the various sort of assessment tools, or any consideration of learning styles. It's just it's an abstraction. And it also, because it is an abstraction, it assumes static borders, while national borders are diminishing. One of the great reasons why intercultural competence is becoming more important is because of the great movement of people. Countries and nations change all the time, so you can't, as soon as we assume a static universe, we get into trouble. So that's Trompenaars. We'll leave this second part of the introduction to intercultural competence themes for this week. Your readings sort of build on these ideas a little more. Got Jackson Jane looking at experiential learning, which is great way to build on what we were looking at last week. Another one on the intercultural development inventory. Again, we're looking a bit more at the assessment part of the process of figuring out how to move between stages of intercultural competency. And for 30 years, we've got Wang looking at again a bit more of the sort of assessment side of things. So I hope you enjoy those readings for this week and find them useful. We're sort of building the main on the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity in the main. There's a few questions down the bottom to sort of provoke, reflection. Your assessment for this week is the Moodle quiz, which is up on Moodle already. Should have a notification email already, so jump on and do that. It's just multiple choice. Shouldn't take too long. You'll have do one of these for week 6, 8, and 10 and 12, I think, alternating with the assessment task 4. So you'll do one research task and then like a short quiz, and we'll call that should do it for your assessments. Coming up in week 5, you've got their assessment task 4.2. Worth 5%. We're looking at the DMIS stage 2 denial. I'll post a forum thread for that one at the end of the week. So check your assessment sheets. I'll update the assessment sheet and post it online. And just have a think about what we've looked at in with the DMIS this week, and think about how to differentiate stage 1 denial from stage 2 defense. Sorry, I'm going to have to change this. It says stage 2 denial. It's stage 2 defense. Do it. So I think I was probably getting tired by the time I got to the last slide. it gets a bit that way sometimes. Just remember it's stage 2 defense. But if you made it this far, thanks for hanging in, everyone, and have a great week. And I'll look forward to catching you again next week and seeing you online. All right.